We'll do it live. Josh just sent you a link.
All right.
And I think I'm about to have an audience of one try to. Oh, my door is locked.
Oh,
not
good.
that I don't. Not that I don't love the short audience of one here. Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you, Manrique. Hi, Tyrell. Nice to see some familiar faces or names.
Yeah, and hopefully Deb will join us.
Woo.
Sure, I have the Twitch channel open. Should I close that? Will it make it confusing?
Oh, up to you. I think as long as you're properly audioed, so you're not getting feedback, it's all good. I also have it open here, though. It looks like the hi, Chris. Looks like the chat thing is working well in FeedYard, so I'm actually going to close that. But yeah,
I closed it because I was starting to hear triplicate of everything. So
yeah. Welcome everybody to what Josh and I have been jokingly calling Free as in Friday, and we were jokingly calling it that, but it turns out there are literally only 2 Google hits for Free as in Friday. So as long as you all don't buy up all the related domain names like immediately after this call in a land rush, I think we're going to be stuck with that name. So just awesome to have all of you here and to have some of you joining us. And it was a very short notice. Hey, you know what? We could do this and we could have some fun doing it. So, we're looking forward to having this conversation. Deb, hi. Thank you you in particular for joining us on such short notice.
It's timely for us. We've lots going on, so I'm happy to come in and whatever, christen this thing.
Right.
In
awesome.
a non-religious way.
That's right.
What's the
whatever your deity of choice is, after the past year that we've had, I think we all should take a deep breath and because it's been a year, right? I mean, I want to talk both, not just about the past year, which is an easy topic, of course, about the future as well, but for OSI, for everybody, right? But it seems like OSI may be better than a lot of organizations has used this year really productively, right? And so I'd love to hear a little bit. Deb, you joined the org in August after you've been in this space obviously forever and a day, but I'm curious, what made you decide that this was a great this was something that made sense and
so I've been thinking I've been an OSI member for a really long time, and I have been forever and a day. I think in people years is like 15 years. So that's how long I've been around the space. It was a couple different things. It was like, knowing that the OSI was going through a transition time, and that's a really exciting time to be involved when people want to like switch things up and become more strategic and forward looking. So that's really exciting to me. And then, I also have this like far away in the future dream of starting an organization of my own someday. And so I thought, well, taking the helm here could be helpful. I would brush up on some of those management skills. We have a number of different contractors that help make everything happen at OSI. So they're all great. Everyone's remote. We don't breathe on each other at work. So that is fantastic. And the board, like, I guess, the final piece for me was just that everyone on the board is lovely. And I was like, oh, so I could work with you all for a year. That would be amazing.
Yeah, my next question was going to actually be to Josh. Josh, what did you do to close the deal?
Well, we got really lucky. No, we're like really, really fortunate to be working with Deb and the person who preceded Deb, Patrick Masson, he was with OSI for 7 years and was the first full-time staff member. And the organization has just evolved so much. But really, only Deb can say what cinched the deal, but really it was key for us to have somebody who has a good reputation, who knows the space. There's both the like, do you have the skills, and also do you have the cultural competency, both in terms of like just the world at large, but open source and software freedom as well. Goes without saying that Deb's reputation preceded her, and we were very, very grateful that she joined. But we were in the middle of a lot of self-work when we started looking for to hire an interim general manager, which Deb is now. I don't know if this is a good moment for me to set the scene a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So I don't think it's any secret that the last few years in licensing have been particularly contentious. And rewind to maybe 2018, I think, is when we got the giant spat of like, all right, here's SSPL, here's the Commons Clause, here's novel thing X, Y, and Z. And people were looking to OSI to respond, to have an opinion on these things, and we did. We absolutely had an opinion, but because of the way the organization works, we have a general manager who runs the operation, but has not been historically empowered with the vision of the organization. That is still really vested in the board, and so when these things were happening, sure, Patrick knew that we needed to respond as a general manager for the organization, but he knew that he would need to go through the board, and we would draft some communications by committee. And 6 weeks after the news was hot, suddenly OSI publishes a statement, and by that time, everybody's kind of moved on, and people started noticing that was a pattern, and we noticed ourselves too, as a member of the board, and it just really brought to the forefront this transition that we've been on the cusp of for years, basically. There's a life cycle that a lot of nonprofits will go through, where it starts as the scrappy band of volunteers, and then suddenly they realize they need a bank account to accept some funds, so they incorporate. And then they realize they don't want to do all the nitty-gritty work, so they start hiring somebody. And OSI got to that, and then just kept doubling down on that, and didn't quite make it to the next step, where the staff is actually empowered with the vision of the organization, and the volunteers, the board is there to supervise and set up some guardrails, but the staff are able to just get things done on their own. And the reality is that OSI cannot be the organization that the community needs if we're continually, operating by committee. And so that's the transition that we're really working through. And so last year, we brought in a consultant, a board whisperer, because though we had tried to do some of the self work ourselves, it's sometimes hard to hear that from other people who aren't neutral parties, right? Like, we all know each other, and if we're suddenly saying something about the board or the way the organization behaves, it's easy to take that personally. So we bring in a board whisperer who can, not be saddled with that history, and help us walk through the process of, looking in the mirror and looking at where we need to go. There's a lot that we've done, but I've also been talking a lot, so I'm just going to put a pin in that and see where we go next.
This is not actually what I had originally, not really in my notes, but I'd love to dig in a little bit, and I suspect at least some of the folks who are listening in would be interested as well. There's always this tension when you're hiring for an open source organization of any sort, for profit or nonprofit, of how you hire for what you called, Josh, cultural competency, right? but yet at the same time to hire for, uh, if you limit yourself to just the people who are already fluent in the difference between free and open, for example, right? Or the nuances, like when you say SSPL, if somebody already knows what SSPL is, in some ways that's a plus, but in some ways it means you're drawing from a very small pool, right?
Well,
And yeah.
I would say, and nonprofits do suffer from this a lot, like any kind of mission-driven work does, where people get like so close to their work. They're like, when I say SSPL, like everyone knows that I mean like a giant tentacle monster, right? And it's like, so, and then it's like, oh, okay, so work on this all day, and then try and get other new people to come in, but don't sound like a person that hasn't left the office in 10 years, because nobody is going to understand what you're talking about. So I my personal thing on how I think nonprofits should deal with this is to take your vacations, go out, or have video calls with friends who don't care about software or licensing. um Go have a hobby that's not like secretly open source embroidery, although that's lovely, you can have that one, but you should have one that's not secretly also open source, like bake bread or something.
For me, that's
And
Wikipedia editing.
oh, close.
No, it's too close. It violates your rule. It is not. Yeah, it's not. I definitely need embroidery or Havoc, who I think many people in the audience know, my co-founder. He has a full. He makes desks.
Wow.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, woodworking.
That's my
It has.
classic. It's like, one day, if all this doesn't work out, I'm going to make furniture. And
I
he's
like it.
doing it. I love that.
He's doing it. It's real. Yeah, and it does not involve screaming at anybody about licensing or citations or anything. It's
Yeah.
really, yeah. So I mean,
But it's like a
so
humane workplace where people are able to disengage, and it's not like, 1,000 tweets are like, you all are terrible, happen like the minute you step away. So like putting in a little breathing space, making sure that people get to step away from their computers. And we blogged about this too, about like, as we're thinking about like the organization as an organization in our space, we've also been thinking a lot about OSI as an employer, and what does it mean to work here. And if it starts to feel, like a cult, and you're not allowed to leave, then we have misstepped a lot.
Well,
So, we've been writing new employee policies, and like test driving that, like, hey, I'll be out of the office for a couple of days, like, y'all good, type of thing.
yeah, and everybody, Deb was just on vacation, and so is joining us on her first day back. So yet another way in which we owe her for jumping in with both feet here. Yeah, I mean, so I guess that boy, I have. We could do a whole panel one of these days, one of these Fridays, just on open source hiring. But I would love it. You wrote that post, and you mentioned in that post that one of the things that was important is that you're not just hiring an executive director, you're hiring potentially second, third future employees, right? And I'd love to hear a little bit, where what's the vision of the organization? Like, I have a pretty good guess of what employee number one is going to do, but employee number two and employee number three, like, does the board, or you, Deb, as somebody who I'm sure will, we know that my understanding at least, that you're leaving the organization, but I'm sure you'll have advice on, where things go afterwards. Where do you all think,
Yeah.
who is that employee number two? Where's that direction going? Where's that going to take the org?
I don't know, Josh, if you want to talk about, like, we got kind of like a mandate from our recent member survey, and I think people want to see us do more to support the open source ecosystem than just the licenses. And we have done that a little less formally, and certainly like all of our board members and staff over the years have given conversations about, like, here's how you should run a project, here's like what kinds of community values you should aspire to, but we haven't been quite so strategic about it. So that's mandate number one. And then I think also like folks would like to see us take more stances on program and policy topics. And that's kind of its own job because you can't like, like we were talking about the 6-week lag in responding to something. And that lag also exists if it's like, hey, something happened in New Zealand, but we don't know anyone in New Zealand. Can someone fill us in? And then 6 weeks later, we'll write about it. And it's like, okay, so I think we probably need someone, at least as a half-time, if not a full-time staff, that is like kind of familiar with the global state of politics as regarding open source and knows what OSI's take on things should be and could almost start writing that piece in their sleep the minute it hits the news.
Right.
There's something that Deb mentioned in there, the member survey that we ran, and much thanks to Alana Hashman, who really was a driving force behind that. We really did get a mandate in the responses we collected. And I want to be clear, like that survey was not of the whole world, of the whole open source ecosystem. It was of people who are basically already in orbit around OSI to some extent. And so, we take that with the appropriate context. But what we heard was that people really wanted OSI to have an opinion on these things, to be saying things, and to be convening conversations about these things. And one of the tensions that, I'll speak only for myself, one of the tensions that I have felt as an officer of the OSI board has been between folks who really want licensing to be a stable thing, open source licensing in particular to be a stable, predictable thing, and folks who think that open source is maybe the definition needs to be updated. And I'm not gonna like pick a side in that. Like, this is a community consensus. This is a community decision for us to make together. But in that, there are two things that have become clear to me. One is that when it comes to licenses, OSI being like in a standards body is really not meant to be on the vanguard, right? OSI is, as a standards organization, is meant to be bringing some consensus and stability to a thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the thing never changes, but it means that generally we're going to be a lagging indicator. But at the same time, while people want that stability and predictability in definition and license, open source licenses, on the flip side, we know that there are things happening at the vanguard, and damn, we better be a part of that conversation. And so this is where we really want to fire up sort of a community engagement engine, if I can be sort of illustrative, where maybe we're not talking about like how to radically change the open source definition, but maybe we are having conversations with people who would want that to happen or have various views and perspectives on that. The bottom line is that we need to be having those conversations, bringing all together the different stakeholders, because OSI occupies a truly unique niche and is in a position to convene those conversations. So to bring us back to the question is like, what is employee 2? What is employee 3? Beyond the executive director, we're looking for a community manager and a communications manager. And I'm not going to be prescriptive about, oh, that's a full-time, part-time. It's not my job to make those decisions. But the bottom line is we need those skills in the organization so that we can host those conversations.
Right. Yeah, I mean, something I've been watching with a lot of interest lately, and something that I will actually be talking to some extent at LibrePlanet about is how is exactly that mechanism of change, right? And Wikipedia has been working with community conveners essentially as part of their work on movement strategy and a universal code of conduct, both of which have been things that haven't really existed before. And what I'll be talking about, LibrePlanet talk will be me in conversation with Catherine Marr of the Wikimedia Foundation, and we'll be talking about this question of how does a tech nonprofit change and adjust to the world in a way that stays true to its values, but also, recognizes that the world's not the same as it was, and the concerns of people are not the same as they were 20 years ago. I really, I feel what you say, Josh, about not necessarily being on the cutting edge, but needing to interact with the cutting edge. And that rings, that rings very true. So interesting to hear that. Yeah.
It does have to be a two-way conversation. Like, I mean, when I was at the FSF many years ago, we were looking at updating the GPL, and instead of just being like, well, 2 or 3 of us can just like sit down, hammer it out in the weekend, and then just tell the community that it's done. It was a 2-year process, and still people were coming in on the last month and being like, hey, I didn't get to say everything that I thought yet. And it was like 2 years. So yeah, so I guess we're telling people early that we're going to be looking for their continuing input.
Yeah, well, the number of people who are watching just dropped, so I think somebody was triggered by the mention of the GPLv3 process.
Oh,
so
never say
apologies.
GPLv4 to any of those people, because they will. I'm sorry, Brett, if you're listening.
Yeah, or it might have been Chris. Who knows? So actually, somebody in the audience asked a question. We need a better term for audience, by the way. I really hate that. It makes it sound so formal, but
us, them.
Yeah. Hello. Community managers usually interface between a commercial part and a volunteer part of the community. What are these parts for OSI, and what's the shared benefit from bringing them together at OSI?
Oh, that's really interesting, because we are ourselves a nonprofit organization, like a charitable 501c3 nonprofit. And so I suspect that the community manager in this place might be a little bit more close to like a community organizer, which is kind of a traditional, person who gathers and feeds and shepherds community in a nonprofit setting. So that would be my guess. I don't know, Josh, if you want to add to that.
I think that's just about right. We're not looking for a community manager who is out there to sell OSI. That's not what we are. That's not what we do. That's not what we need. But we do need. No, we don't have anything to sell, right? But what we do need is somebody who can help set up the infrastructure to convene those conversations. Somebody who can be a moderator, somebody who knows where to go to bring people into the conversation. So really, it's the community manager is really the community organizer. However we want to describe this, the role that OSI needs is somebody who can be a host, basically, and bring people together.
Sorry, distracted a little bit by a new guest in chat with some great dad jokes. So learnings for next time. Somebody needs to be there for moderating. I think one way that you can think of, one way that I think of community management and community organizing, Deb, is that in some sense, it's the interface between the people who are doing this, who are lucky enough to do this full time, and the people who aren't, right? And that is very much a challenge that OSI has had over the years, right? And I certainly think that lens, community management is one of the things that can be brought to the table. Right. Because there are, for a little while, I know that OSI was helping, for example, with the license review list. And I promise this would not be a talk about licenses today, but, I think this is a useful example, right? They're triggering. I mean, they're all right. Deb's on the hook for another one just about licenses. I mean, and there's a comment in chat about W3C experiences, right? The web content accessibility guidelines took years to reach from 1 to 2. these things are hard, right? They take,
Yeah.
they're easy to do when you're small, and they're hard to do. This certainly, I see one of the challenges, and actually one of the things I'd love to hear from you two about is, in a world where simultaneously, literally millions of people do open source, right? Depending on who you ask, it's single digit millions or tens of millions, right? Which is not what not how things were when Deb and I got involved, right? And they have a lot of different definitions of open source. How do you you know how do you deal with that, right? How do you do that interaction? Does that change how the organization thinks about its mission and its priorities?
I mean, I think there has to be, for any nonprofit organization, there has to be some continuity. And for every organization, I would hope there needs to be a certain amount of integrity. So we put out the open source definition. If you're going to use the term open source, then it can't be a bait and switch. So that's number one. And then, like, it has to be clear. It can't be that people read something one day and then the next week it changes, like drastically after 20 years. So people need to have like a definition that they can rely on, that is like updated, maybe expanded, but not a complete like left turn difference from what we've been doing. If you want to do something like that, you can call it something else, perhaps. um you know that's up to you, but I think for organizations in transition, it's always like kind of like bringing everybody with you so that there's some continuity, and then making sure that you're maintaining integrity. Not that I'm saying we're going to have trouble with that, but that like some of the other ideas when out there about like what you can do with software and licenses, when followed to their logical conclusion or their end game, if you're calling them open source, then it feels a little like you showed up at a hotel room with the fisheye lens off, and like all of a sudden you find out you're staying in a bathtub for a week. So we don't want to do that to people, and we don't want to encourage other folks to do that, especially calling it open source.
Yeah, this is something that I feel a real personal connection to, because of course I come from a different wave of open source and software freedom participants than either Deb or Lewis do. I was a developer a web developer for years, using open source without really realizing that it was novel. To me, it just felt like, I was a fish in water. Like, this is just how things go. And I grew up alongside peer-to-peer file sharing and user-generated content, so it all just felt like a natural extension of that. But when I realized that something special was going on, that this was like a genuinely novel approach to intellectual property, and I only learned that really thanks to being installed at O'Reilly Media as a community manager for OSCON. It was a fascinating experience because I had been a user of open source for years, and a creator with open source for years. And yet when I would go to conferences and I would go to meetups and I would tell people, oh, I'm a web developer and I work with PHP, or heaven forbid, I tell them I'm a marketer or a community manager, and people would start like, they would look down on me. They would be like, oh, that's not a real programming language, or like, oh, that's not like, marketing, gross, ew. And to me, that was really shocking, because like quality software takes all types to build. And no matter how good the software is, if it's not marketed well, why does it matter? But also, like, web developers are, I don't have the data to back this up, but I've just got this sense that this is probably the single largest population of open source developers on the planet, just because of how easy it is to get into web development. It's just an accessible part of the field. And so for web developers, particularly like the PHP and the JavaScript communities, to be treated as other or less than by sort of the large chunks of the existing open source community, not that it's a monolith, but it really, like, we were shutting people out. And so, some people say like, oh, we've got the GitHub generation now, right? Like, and you could say like, I might have just predated that by a few years, but like, I'm effectively part of that, where open source was just the water we swam in. We didn't question it. And so open source, we have our own definition of what that means, and that has very little relation to the actual open source definition. And we have to unpack that. We have to bring these people into the fold. We have to have those conversations and meet people where they're at.
I mean, it is interesting. Like, so we have like these nonprofits that work on free and open source software, and I'm coming from the nonprofit background. So the part that was missing most obviously to me was some of the knowledge that nonprofits really work on honing, which includes messaging and volunteer recruitment and retention, making sure that you're thinking about like how you explain things so that you're getting people where they are and not making them feel bad about the things they don't know yet. Yeah, so having started 15 years ago, I kept being like, really? We're gonna just say that? Wow. Or that just came out of your mouth. Like, this person's been sitting here stuffing envelopes for like 4 hours for no money. Like, I'm not saying you have to kiss their what, but like maybe lay off on the shade. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a very real challenge, right? I mean, that happens, as you say, Deb. I think one of the things that's interesting, that a change that I have seen over time in this space, right, is that we used to think that we were very different from everybody else, and I'm really glad to see more and more people using some of the same language of other, acknowledging that a open source nonprofit is still, at the end of the day, a nonprofit with all the, not just in like the technical 501c3 sense, but in the in the sort of structural sense of like who's attracted to it, what management challenges does it have that are different from for profits and things like that, right? And it is, and similarly, when you say community organizing, right, like there's a lot of wheels that we reinvented over the years that if we'd maybe we've all got stories there.
Can I
right?
save everyone from reinventing another one that OSI is already doing? Strategic planning. It's awesome. Like, who knows where we're going to be in 5 years? It could be you in your own organization right now. You could start making a plan and then you could go there. So don't reinvent that. There are people that can help you do it. There are books. There's lots of books. There's probably like a newsletter about it. I don't even know. But like, do strategic planning. Nonprofits figured it out. They have all these tools, all these things. You can just do it and then you'll know where your org's headed.
Well, so actually, that brings me around to one of the things that I wanted to ask about. You recently published a new, revised, updated mission statement. And I'm curious sort of what you all think of, is that going to impact the strategy? Does that change, impact either the day-to-day or the 5-year strategy?
Josh, I think you should take that one because I know you were part of those conversations.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It impacts our strategy, our planning, our vision. So the updated mission that we have, and I'll verbalize this in a moment here, was just one deliverable, one milestone in this sort of reform process that we're going through. And first we talked about our governance, like what is the role of the board, what is the role of the staff, how do we want to relate to each other? Oh, you're a saint. Thank you, Lewis.
This is the new one.
So we, first we worked through like, well, what's our relation internally? And then we started working through, okay, let's work on a new mission, because the last time we wrote a mission was 20 some odd years ago. It included a lot of language that just isn't relevant anymore. We have different challenges now. And so yeah, OSI, as the steward of the open source definition, we set the foundation for the open source software ecosystem. And there are a few notable things about that refined mission statement. First of all, there's the relationship between OSI and the open source definition, and there's a stewardship relationship there, which suggests which should be interpreted as like OSI doesn't own the open source definition. We're the keeper of it, and because OSI is a community run organization, of, by, for the community kind of thing. The open source definition can evolve with the community, with OSI, right? We haven't defined what that would look like, what that process would look like, but there should be one should read this mission and understand that this is not not set in stone, but it is something that we need to mind and take care of. And then there's the second half, that we set the foundation for the open source software ecosystem. And that's thinking about how OSI sees itself as being a cornerstone in the ecosystem, being something that everything else can be built around and on top of. And we are not the ecosystem. That's one thing that one should be clear in this mission, is we're not conflating ourselves with the whole world and the ecosystem. We're just setting a foundation for it. But also in that, we're leaving the door open for what else might OSI do to set that foundation, because licenses are not the end all be all of open source, right? Licenses are a means to an end to deliver a certain type of collaboration and a certain type of freedom, depending on your philosophies here. And so for this helps us think about like, oh, how can OSI relate to open source in a way that isn't just strictly about licenses? Because that's the gap that we need to clear, and we need to clear that in a way that we're very intentional about. So moving forward, what does this mean is, well, now the board is in the process of setting its new vision. We've identified like, okay, here's our universe of stakeholders. Here are the stakeholders that can help us keep the lights on over the next 24 months to make sure that we're sustainable and we exist in the first place, which is not a foregone conclusion, I should say. The pandemic has been very difficult for the organization, just like many others. But now it's like, well, what's the vision? Where do we want to be in 3 years? And where do we want to be in 5 years? And I can't tell you what that is, because that's an ongoing conversation. But that's what we're doing now, is we're pulling that out, and we're coming to an agreement on what that vision is. And the aim is to have that solidified before the new executive director comes on board, because we want the person who steps into that role to be clear on where we're trying to go. And without that, I feel like we'd probably be setting them up for failure. We don't want that.
Well, let me push. I really want to. One of my goals for doing these chats is that I want to strive to honor some of the Tidelifty values of optimism and pragmatism, right? So I don't want to set these up as sort of either negative or rehashing some of the same conversations that have been had 1,000 times. But I think you really hit on something pretty important, right, Josh, where you talked about these licenses can be the basis either for a vision of freedom, or these are not exclusive, right? They can be at the same time. But some people see them very much as a tool for specific kinds of freedom, for who is maybe a whole nother conversation, or a sort of pragmatic basis for, I think the about page, the OSI about page talks about higher quality, better reliability, greater flexibility, lower cost, and an end to predatory vendor lock-in, which is a great set of words, but is not necessarily, there's a lot of card-carrying FSF members on the OSI board now, right? And, on the OSI staff. That gap has closed. But yet, there are still there is still I shouldn't say the gap is closed. I just say the two sides of the gap are talking to each other, which, as some of the audience knows, was not always the case, right? What's that? Is that a productive gap? Is that something we should close even tighter? How does that look?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. And you made it sound like it was going to be all softball.
Oh no, that was a pre-apology. That was This is supposed to be softballs, but I can't help myself.
So I guess you're kind of trying to re-ask, like, in a new era, what is the difference between what the FSF does and what the OSI does? And so I think it is there in the mission statement, the foundation for the open source software ecosystem. So we're really looking at that ecosystem stuff. And, it's, I think that the FSF is looking at some other things like getting people to use and choose free software alternatives, which is a really different audience than the people who are making and litigating about open source software licenses. Although, there's obviously some overlap because you can't really escape open source software. And, I think, and the FSF is looking at this like kind of more from a movement. And I feel like maybe we're going more with a little bit of like a servant leadership model, and kind of saying like, okay, you want to use open source, how can we help? And that's a little bit different than like, here are a bunch of things that you should probably stay away from, or, here's a nice alternative to something, that like, you could use for video chat instead of a proprietary thing, which is a little bit more user focused. That's not to say that the FSF doesn't care deeply about developer rights. I believe they do. Sure. So there's some overlap, but it's, you kind of teased out this difference between folks who are doing things as volunteers and folks that are doing things as paid staff. And I think that a lot of the things that we're looking at are conglomerate projects that have a lot of folks doing this for their paid job. So looking at those big platforms, making sure that those remain accessible to smaller players and that people can kind of figure out how to get in. And that stuff does some like really critical things, and conservancy too, like projects that are not super lucrative but are still super important. And so, we're just kind of looking at different parts of that ecosystem, but we're really looking at folks who are showing up and saying like, I think I want to do open source. Like, how do I do it? Whereas the FSF is doing a little, in some ways, the harder work of pulling people in who are like, I feel like I'm not in charge of my phone. What's going on with that? And they're like, oh, we're so glad you asked. So it's a different entry point.
Yeah. And I think I think that's a productive difference too. I think one of the key words in that new mission is ecosystem. And that suggests a certain kind of thinking where like, okay, well, we're all players in this ecosystem. How can we work together in a way that's a net positive for everyone in that ecosystem? And one of the ways that we do that is not by doing the exact same things as each other, right? There's productive differences between us. And while, some are working on the software freedom sort of advocacy front and the movement building, which is absolutely essential. OSI is working on sort of like, well, how do I incorporate this? How do I engage with this? And it's a different mission, and we need both. And so it's very much like let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think, and I maybe should have prefaced the question with this as well. We are in such a much better place, I think, than where we were 10 or even 5 years ago, right? Where the differences between the two organizations are much more about sort of that kind of thoughtful approach and differences, right, that you two just outlined, versus, honestly, some of the personality-based differences that we had in the past, right? I actually, let me pivot that real quick. Heather had a great comment about today I spent time, with global OSM mappers. For those of you who don't know, Heather's very active in OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap, I'm sure if you're in this audience, you know what it is. they each said that open source can support their agenda to be equal and to have the ability to shape how open can help them. And so how are we providing this space? And I think there's, this general, what is it, historically, as you all know, right, the board of OSI has been almost entirely North American and European, better than some organizations in that respect, but not a ton. How does for a movement or an ecosystem that really is global, how do we walk that walk, not just talk that talk?
Yeah, Hung Fukune, who's the vice chair of the OSI board, just gave a talk at FOSDEM on like why a lot of open source software culture tends to be really US centric, but it isn't really helping us out. Again, I'm going to get on the, don't like crawl up so far inside yourself that you don't know what's going on. And that's the case here too. Especially as we're looking outward at some of the policy things. It's like the US has been behind. I don't know, it's like we were asleep for 4 years on this front, perhaps. But it's maybe longer.
Asleep.
Asleep. I'm not trying to pull us in on that one, but there's a lot of things that people are doing in other places, looking at like how do we set standards and legislate around like things where it's like, oh, is this like a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory thing where like everyone should have access to this platform? So like we aren't even really having those discussions yet in the US. There's a lot of places where like the procurement processes in different countries prefer open source, and if you don't want to use open source, you have to say why, because of the vendor lock-in that not only we're not the only people that don't like that. And so, it's like this, looking at like the global open source community. And I think, before I got here, but also currently in our board composition, been really actively encouraging folks to help us bring in a more global perspective. So I think that it's gotten better. And we actually have a really good roster of folks running now from all over the globe, which is exciting. So, so I hope we'll be able to keep pushing the boundaries of those conversations so that they're not always US centric, because I think it's like that's just not how software development really works.
So actually, let me take that as a chance. What should the folks who are here today, some of whom are pretty have really good networks, what should we know about the upcoming elections?
Well, we have a whole bunch of folks running. I can try and see if I've got the link where it shows. Although I just got 2 more candidate nominations, like right before I hopped on this video call. So
when's the deadline for self-nominations?
So self-nomination, I'll just drop this into the. I don't know if I'm allowed to do these things like you have. I'll put it in the chat though. So those are all the board election deadlines, but the last day to nominate is March 2nd, and the last day for folks to renew their membership if they want to vote is March 4th.
Right.
So if you're thinking of running, you better get on it. And don't leave your membership to the last minute, like especially if you only use PayPal once a year for us or something like that. Like do it a couple days early. So I ask on behalf of our beloved administrative person. So yeah, it's this year we have 2 seats, individual nomination seats up, and 2 affiliate nomination seats up. So affiliate members are organizations that have gone through like a process with us and participate in quarterly calls. And they can nominate folks for 2 of the seats on the board this year. And then individual nominations, people can nominate themselves. You can nominate someone else, but then we're going to check and make sure they actually want to do it. So it's faster if you just nominate yourself on the individual ones. So so 4 seats up of a 10-person board. So that's a huge opportunity to shift the conversation or add things to it that have not been part of it previously. Especially if you heard something like, "Ooh, I I loved what you said about the future of the organization. Like, I wonder if you really, can pull through on that. You can come and help us do it.
Yeah, so a little more about that. Like OSI, OSI has a board of directors, like any old, incorporated legal entity will. The OSI board of directors is it's a 10-person board. 8 of those seats are elected by the community, half by affiliate organizations that, like Deb described, and the other half are individuals who nominate themselves. And then we have 2 seats that we retain as appointed seats that the board uses to fill in any skill gaps that or perspective gaps that are lacking on the board. So Lewis, you rightly observed that OSI's board composition has long been pretty heavy on North America and Europe, and not much else. If you look at the board composition before we switched to member elections, which was about 8 years ago, in 2013 was our first board election, the board composition was actually more diverse when it was a fully appointed board. And I mean that geographically as well. And so this is one of the difficulties of switching to an election system. And I wouldn't go back on that. We need to create that opportunity for both accountability and fresh perspectives and churn. But what comes with that is like, well, you have elections and you end up with like popularity contests, and that can be that there are pros and cons there. But one of the things that I want to mention is that the board has shifted from being like a working board where we really need board members to be operationally involved with the organization, to we're in the middle of this transition to where we want a board who can be there as supervisors and bring to bear on OSI's work key perspectives. But one of the nice things about this transition that we're going through is that board service will take less time and require less expertise to feel like you're useful on the board, right? Because when I joined the board, I was like, well, okay, I guess I'm good at like web development and social media. Let me see how I can contribute in these areas. That is not how we think about our board now. That's not what we don't want to think about that. What we want is like, do you represent a community? Do you have a certain unique perspective that maybe is underrepresented in open source that we don't hear enough from? Well, then you're exactly the kind of person who should be running for the board, because we need your perspectives. We need to make sure that the board of OSI is as representative as possible of the global open source ecosystem. And by shifting to sort of a staff-driven org, the board no longer needs to be so time consuming or like you better have these skills or you shouldn't apply. So really, I just want to encourage people, throw your hat in the ring. And maybe if you even if you don't work for or run for the board, maybe consider like applying to work at OSI or another foundation, because the foundation space has just as much of a need for new contributors as the projects themselves.
Well, it looks like from comments we have 1 membership renewal already, so that's a 10% hit rate on our audience today. So, yeah, Shane says it's so hard to attract new people to boards, pondering very similar questions at ASF these days. Yeah, what a tough balancing act, right? Because there are still some things that, for example, you all are doing hiring of, I say you all as if I'm not still a board member emeritus or whatever that title is. And at least I'm not on the mailing list anymore. But, there's still going to have to be hiring done, right? Which the board is presumably going to be involved in. The license review process has historically been run by a board member, though I don't know if that's something that you all have considered changing.
Pam is staying, and it's good to do that for a while, which we are very grateful for, absolutely. Yeah, but it's possible that some portion of that activity might become, like if we can carve some of the more I don't know, like mundane tasks off and relieve Pam of some of those things. That's something that we might be looking at.
Hooray!
Woo. Oh, that's
Fantastic.
delightful.
That's that. I almost wanted to close right there because that just seems like a great a great note to end on. But I mean, where do you think? I think maybe a good chance with our last few minutes here. What is the what's the positive, like, if OSI and, like, you asked Deb this question of, like, 5 years strategic, or you said we're doing strategic planning now, what, like, if there's one awesome fun thing that you'd really love to see, that, like, the next ED in 5 years has done some awesome thing. Obviously they're going to have a lot of say in this as the ED, but, like, is there some, like, really cool thing on the radar that you think is going to be either an awesome concrete thing or an awesome opportunity for them to explore? Like, what are you excited about?
I'd love to see that person be able to take to the organization to a place where there are 3 full-time staff people. That to me would be super exciting, because I'm now doing all of the things with some consulting, and I can see how much more the org could get done if they had 3 full-time staff people.
Yeah, I agreed. I want to see the organization in 5 years with a small but mighty staff. We don't need to grow endlessly, but we do need we do need more headcount than we do right now, or than we have right now. But that's sort of like an internal perspective, right? Like, that's like, well, what does the ecosystem get with an OSI that has some staff, right? And I think this is back to the sort of the community engagement piece, the convening conversations. Like, in 5 years, OSI should be convening the conversations about, I mean, hopefully sooner than 5 years, we'll see, about open governance, about the different collaboration styles, about all of these things that open source has been overloaded as a phrase, like, so overloaded with meaning, and we need to start unpacking that. And I'm not saying that we should go back and try to pull out these meanings. They're valid, they're important, they're key to what open source is. Whether they're about licenses or not, they're key to what open source is. And so we need to have those conversations, and hopefully OSI can be the one convening them. I am very excited, just very concretely, as we're approaching the end here. OSI hosted its first ever conference last year, State of the Source Summit. And while I've grown to get a bit jaded with online events, it was a spectacular experience. And I think that is one great way that we can convene conversations. And I know that is something that we're going to be doing more of. And I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I can't even, it's like I was saying at the beginning of the hour, OSI, more than most organizations, I feel like, kept an even keel and in a really rough year. And I said that not even thinking about State of the Source. So yeah, hats off to both of you for, I mean, I know, Deb, you weren't as involved in State of the Source, but hats off to both of you for stewarding that. What an amazing year.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Again, Deb, thank you so much for not just joining us, but color coordinating your room with the Tidelift brand.
Yeah.
Do
you like my Tidelift orange dining room?
Yeah. I think it's terrific. I'm sorry you couldn't get the purple stripe at the top in time, but
maybe
I look forward to pictures next. Yeah. And thank you to everybody who joined. I think we'll be doing this again. So
I look forward to it.
All right.
Exciting.
Thanks everybody.
Have a great weekend, y'all.